The sun had barely started its slow climb over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the dusty streets of the small town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the sounds of horses' hooves or a wagon creaking on the main street could echo through the air like a gentle song. The air smelled faintly of hay and fresh bread from the little bakery on the corner. The town wasn't much, just a cluster of wooden buildings, a few shops, a small cafe, and the general store that had been here longer than anyone could remember. Yet, for people like Jake, a cowboy who had spent more years on the road than in any town, it felt like a safe place, a pause from the endless open spaces and dusty trails. Jake pushed the door of the general store open, and the familiar jingle of the bell above the door rang softly. He had been traveling for days, riding from ranch to ranch, making sure all his accounts were settled and debts paid. Life on the road was simple but demanding. He was used to the silence of the prairie and the occasional company of ranchers or townsfolk, but mostly, it was just him and the horizon. Today, however, his mission was simple. He needed to pay a debt to the store owner and move on. That was all. Or so he thought. Inside, the store smelled of dried herbs, fresh bread, and a faint hint of leather from the boots hanging on the racks. Shelves lined the walls, stacked neatly with jars, canned goods, and household supplies. Behind the counter, a young woman was bending down, reaching for a tin jar that had fallen behind a shelf. Her movements were careful, almost delicate, but there was a quiet strength in the way she worked. She didn't notice Jake at first, completely absorbed in her task, humming softly to herself, a tune that was unfamiliar but comforting in its simplicity. Her hair fell slightly over her face, and as she straightened up, her posture and calm presence made the store feel warmer, more alive than it had in a long time. Jake cleared his throat softly, and she looked up, startled for a moment, then smiled politely. There was something in her eyes, bright, attentive, and gentle, that immediately caught his attention. He had been around many people, seen many faces, but something about this young woman held him for a moment longer than he expected. He reminded himself why he was there, trying to push away the sudden distraction. "I just came to pay you," he said, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of uncertainty. Clara, the store clerk, nodded and started gathering the ledger and cash from the drawer. She spoke softly. "All right. That will be $30 for the supplies." Her voice was calm, confident, and pleasant. The kind of voice that made people listen carefully without realizing it. Jake reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. As he counted the bills, he noticed, without meaning to, the way she moved, the way she reached for the money, the way her fingers brushed against the notes as she organized them. His thoughts, which had been focused solely on settling the payment, began to wander. It was strange for Jake. He had spent years on the road, interacting with people, but never had a simple moment like this made him forget everything else. The debt he had come to settle seemed trivial now compared to the quiet presence of the young woman in front of him. He fumbled slightly with the bills, clearing his throat again, trying to regain focus. Clara noticed the hesitation but didn't comment. She simply continued her task, her hands steady, her eyes polite yet curious. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the moment shared without words. For a few seconds, the store felt suspended in time. The sunlight from the window illuminated the dust motes floating in the air, casting a golden glow around the young clerk. Jake watched her, realizing he had forgotten the purpose of his visit, for just a fleeting, but powerful, moment. He thought about how simple life on the road had been, how predictable it often felt, and how moments like this reminded him that there were small, unexpected joys even in the quietest places. Clara handed him the change, counting it carefully. "Here's your balance," she said softly. Jake accepted it, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked at her again, noticing details he hadn't intended to the way her hair caught the light, the sincerity in her smile, the calm confidence in her movements. It wasn't something that could be described as beauty in the usual sense. It was something deeper, something quietly compelling. He realized that this small encounter, this simple interaction, had left a stronger impression on him than any conversation he had had in months on the road. "Thank you," he said, finally focusing again on the money. But even as he spoke, he knew that the words carried more than just politeness. They were a reflection of the strange pull he felt, a pull he couldn't quite explain, but that made him linger a little longer than necessary. Clara smiled again, this time with a hint of amusement, noticing the momentary distraction in the usually composed cowboy. He placed the money carefully in the cash drawer and turned to leave, but found himself pausing at the door. For a brief moment, he simply watched her as she went back to her tasks, bending and straightening, moving with a quiet rhythm that made the world outside feel far away. He realized that he had come into the store with a purpose, with a practical, simple goal. But now, that goal seemed almost insignificant. As he stepped outside into the warm sunlight, Jake felt an unusual lightness. The road awaited him, as always, stretching out endlessly. But the memory of that small, quiet moment lingered. He thought about how unpredictable life could be, how even the simplest encounters could leave a lasting mark. Clara went back to her work inside, unaware of the depth of impact a stranger had just had on her day. Yet the exchange, brief as it was, had created a subtle connection, delicate but real. Riding slowly out of town, Jake kept thinking about the young woman in the store. He reminded himself that he had a journey to continue, debts to settle, and work to finish. Yet, in his mind, he kept replaying the scene the way she had bent to pick up the jar, the soft smile that followed, and the calm, gentle presence she carried effortlessly. It was strange how the human heart worked, how a single glance, a small gesture, could capture attention and leave a memory that refused to fade. That evening, as Jake set up camp a few miles outside of town, he couldn't help but smile. He thought about the encounter, not as a distraction, but as a reminder that even in the quiet, dusty corners of life, in the simplest moments, there could be unexpected beauty, subtle and real, that could shift perspective in the blink of an eye. For the first time in a long while, the road seemed less lonely. Not because of the journey itself, but because of the thought of someone waiting somewhere, even unknowingly, to leave a small, meaningful mark on another person's life. The next morning, the town woke slowly, with the soft chirping of birds and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the small bakery on the corner. The streets were quiet at first. Only a few townsfolk moving about, with the usual business of their day. Jake returned to town on his horse, not with the intent to pay another bill, but with a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, a quiet desire to see the young woman again, to perhaps share a small conversation. As he approached the general store, he noticed Clara arranging the shelves near the window, the morning sunlight falling across her shoulders. She looked up and caught sight of him, offering a polite nod, her face calm but with a spark of recognition. Jake felt a subtle warmth in that simple gesture, the kind that made him momentarily forget the world beyond the store. He tied his horse near the post outside and stepped in, careful to let the bell ring softly above the door. Clara smiled, moving closer to the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and friendly. "Did you sleep well last night?" Jake blinked, caught off guard. No one had asked him that in a long time, not with such genuine interest. "I did," he replied, his voice softening. The stars were bright, and the air was clear. A good night for riding. He noticed how naturally she listened, not interrupting, not pretending, just giving her full attention. They began talking in small ways at first, exchanging the simple, everyday details of life. Clara spoke about her family in the town, the history of the general store, and the routines that made her life steady and reliable. Jake, in return, told her of his travels, not of grand adventures or dangers, but of quiet moments on the road, of long days riding between ranches, of sunsets that stretched for miles and nights filled with the soft calls of distant animals. He spoke in a way that was honest, without exaggeration. And she listened with interest, occasionally asking questions, her curiosity gentle and natural. Time seemed to move differently inside that small store. The world outside, with its chores and schedules, faded slightly as they talked. Jake realized he had never had a conversation quite like this in years of traveling. Usually, people were polite, but conversations rarely reached beyond the surface. Clara's presence, her calm and attentive way of engaging, made him feel unusually open, unusually comfortable. It was as if the store itself had become a small island, removed from the ordinary rhythm of life, where a single encounter could hold meaning. At one point, Jake noticed a small display of postcards near the counter. He picked one up. A simple picture of the town, with horses grazing in the distance. "I've passed by places like this 100 times," he said. "But there's something about this town. It feels different. Quiet. But not empty." Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "I suppose that's because it's lived in," she said. "Every corner, every building, has a story. Even this store has its stories. Some old, some new. You just have to notice them." Jake smiled, realizing that she had captured the essence of his own travels in her words. It was remarkable how a stranger, a person he had just met, could express a sentiment that echoed his own thoughts. For the first time, he felt a quiet connection, the kind that didn't rush or demand, but simply existed in the space between two people. The morning passed, and the store grew slightly busier as townsfolk came in for supplies. Jake and Clara continued their conversation in small intervals, pausing as customers entered or left. Each time, they picked up where they had left off, their words flowing easily, naturally. It was in these small exchanges, these moments of attention, that a deeper understanding began to form. Jake felt respect for her diligence and calmness, and Clara, in turn, sensed the sincerity and thoughtfulness in him. Eventually, the bell above the door rang again as Jake prepared to leave. "I should get back to the road," he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. He reached for the door, then paused, turning back slightly. "It's rare to meet someone who listens the way you do." Clara smiled, a gentle, real smile that reached her eyes. "And it's rare to meet someone who speaks honestly," she replied. Outside, the sun was higher now, warming the wooden buildings and the dusty streets. Jake mounted his horse, but unlike yesterday, he didn't feel the weight of the road pressing on him. Instead, there was a sense of quiet anticipation, a thought that maybe life on the road could wait a little longer. He looked back at the store, seeing Clara in the window, adjusting items on the shelves, a small figure of calm in the bustling world. Over the next few days, Jake returned to the town, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Each visit was brief, simple, a wave, a shared conversation, a small exchange of stories. Clara began to recognize him immediately, and the warmth in her greeting grew with each encounter. They spoke about simple things: the changing weather, the cattle on nearby ranches, the subtle beauty of the prairie at sunrise and sunset. But in these ordinary details, they discovered something extraordinary. A connection that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Jake found himself walking with Clara outside the store. They had stepped into the quiet street, far from the business of customers and chores, letting the soft light of the evening fill the space between them. The town felt peaceful, almost timeless. For a moment, words were unnecessary. They simply walked side by side, noticing the subtle details of the world around them. The faint smell of wildflowers, the distant sound of a horse's whinny, the slow rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. Jake realized that what he had initially thought was distraction, something fleeting, had grown into a genuine feeling of appreciation and connection. Clara, too, felt a sense of comfort in his presence, an understanding that someone could recognize and value the quiet aspects of life, the moments that often went unnoticed. It was not love in its dramatic, overwhelming form. It was something more subtle, more real, a human connection built on attention, honesty, and respect. As the evening faded into twilight, they returned to the store, talking softly, laughing at small things, sharing details of their days. When it was time for Jake to leave again, neither of them rushed the moment. He mounted his horse slowly, looking back at her one last time. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. Clara nodded, her smile reassuring, knowing he meant it. Jake rode out of town, but the road felt different now. He thought about the quiet strength of the young woman, the calm way she had carried herself, and the simple, meaningful moments they had shared. For the first time in years, the open prairie and endless trails didn't feel lonely. Instead, there was the comfort of knowing that even in a world full of distance and movement, connections could form, unexpected and real, leaving marks that lasted far longer than any temporary stop along the road. Days turned into a week, and Jake continued to return to the town. Their conversations grew deeper, though still simple. They spoke about hopes and small dreams, the things that mattered to them quietly but profoundly. Clara shared her love for small gardens behind the store, where she grew flowers that brightened her little world. Jake spoke of nights under the stars, of the freedom and solitude of the open range, and the strange beauty in both the emptiness and the endless horizon. Through these exchanges, both realized that life was often a series of small, unnoticed moments. And yet, sometimes, a single encounter could change one's perspective, leaving a sense of warmth and understanding that lingered far longer than the initial meeting. Their connection wasn't defined by grand gestures, but by quiet attention, mutual respect, and the willingness to notice the small details of another person's life. Finally, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and painted the sky in deep shades of amber and purple, Jake prepared to leave the town for the road again. Clara stood in the doorway of the store, her silhouette framed by the fading light. They shared a long look, not needing words. In that quiet moment, both understood the impact of their brief but meaningful encounters, the human connections that could arise unexpectedly, and the way even the simplest moments could linger in memory, changing the way one saw the world. Jake tipped his hat, smiled genuinely, and said, "I'll be back." Clara waved, a small but sincere gesture, knowing that some connections were not about grand promises or declarations, but about the quiet, steady presence of someone who truly noticed you. As he rode away, Jake felt a sense of calm, a reassurance that the world, with all its vastness and unpredictability, could still hold moments of quiet beauty and human connection, moments that made the long roads and dusty trails of life worthwhile.